Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix, and today for my Writer's Writer series, I am going to talk about Joan Didion's book, Year of Magical Thinking. I'm really excited to do this, and so yeah, without further ado, let's dive right in. This is The Year of Magical Thinking by the author Joan Didion. Now, the thing to be aware of about this book is that it is very much a book centered on grief and loss. Joan Didion has a wonderful family, her husband John and her daughter Quintana. But she is struck in a year by unbelievable tragedy where her husband passes away and where her daughter develops a hematoma, which is a medical condition in the brain that basically puts her life at risk. And the thing about this book is that it does detail a lot of events. So it details Quintana's recovery cycle and at least her attempts at recovery. And the thing that is tragic about Quintana's situation is that she does eventually pass away. But this book, at this time in which Joan Didion is writing, she actually doesn't know if Quintana is going to pass away. So the details about Quintana are all about her recovery and her trying to get better, but also experiencing very extreme medical trauma. So the other thing is John, who passes away from a heart attack. And in the book, Joan Didion is constantly wrestling with the reality that her husband passed away. And so even though the book details a lot of the experiences that Joan Didion has with seeing her daughter in decline, with seeing her husband pass away, and the grief that that brings, the reason why it's called the Year of Magical Thinking is of course because of what the book actually details itself in terms of its thought about basically thinking your way out of complex trauma, thinking your way out of complex difficulties and adversity in life. And so she actually spends a lot of time reflecting and trying to make sense of what's going on. And that's why I think this book is really interesting, because it does detail an actual memoir. It does detail a story of what's going on, but it also details all of these deep thoughts. And it's very interesting to think about as Joan Didion writes and as you read the book. The book, then, is about trauma. And it's about trauma in both senses of the word. It is trauma that comes from the grief and loss that you feel whenever you lose a loved one. In this case, when Joan Didion loses her husband, as well as potentially losing her daughter. But it's also trauma in terms of physical trauma. And so the interesting thing about this book is that even though Joan Didion doesn't actually use that word trauma in that specific way, she's very much linking the ideas together because she's trying to understand how trauma impacts the mind, the psyche, the soul, how it impacts you personally, while also experiencing very real trauma. And so the reason why I bring up the other definition of trauma in terms of physical trauma is because she actually describes in the book many, many details of people who have experienced physical trauma and death. And that is what makes this book unbelievably visceral and raw, which is that there are countless examples in this book of people who experience trauma and die. So for example, someone who uses cocaine and dies from, I believe, a brain hemorrhage, if I understood that correctly, as well as characters or people who literally die in accidents that she describes throughout the book. And this makes the book very unsettling. It makes it very difficult to read. But I think this explicit or even implicit connection of both versions of trauma show the complexity and difficulty of life and the reality and encroaching realism of death. And I think that is what makes this book so unbelievably brutal, that she is linking these ideas together, these often seemingly disparate definitions, and is bringing them into a very raw and visceral framework. So Joan Didion is very much trying to figure out how to figure out all of these terrible things, these traumatic events that are happening, of all of this unbelievable loss and this reckoning with this brutal reality of death in the 21st century, where death seems right around the corner. And it actually reminds me in an interesting way of C.S. Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain, which I believe captures this intense theme of pain and suffering in life. The idea that suffering can often feel so senseless, it can often feel so pointless, and yet we have to experience it. And even though C.S. Lewis is writing in a completely different tradition from Joan Didion of who I believe is atheist and who very much focuses on physical details of trauma and death, and not from a spiritual perspective, very much captures this sense of pain in a way that I think C.S. Lewis captures as well. And C.S. Lewis's book might be a little bit more spiritual and capture that feeling, but it's definitely very interesting that there is a little bit of a parallel, even though they are working from completely different traditions. So like I said earlier, the year of magical thinking is a year of trying to think your way out of grief. It's trying to think your way out of trauma. And I think what makes this book so unbelievably amazing is that she's constantly trying to wrestle with this reality of death, and she's trying to figure that out, and she's using writing as a way to try to accomplish that understanding. Now, I think what makes this book incredibly difficult to read is that you realize the limits of language, you realize the limits of ideas, you realize the limits of words and writing to be able to figure these things out. And I think this is what I want to hit at with my Writer's Writer series in this specific episode, which is that writing can be both an amazing tool to be able to discover things about yourself and about the world, being able to figure things out, being able to understand things, but it can also sometimes fall short of being able to actually discover things and figure things out. And so I think this book is right at that limit of someone who wrote this incredibly intelligent book, who still doesn't have answers, who still has a lack of resolution, who still doesn't fully know what is going on around her, or even inside of her with her grief and trauma. And I think that that is what is amazing about this book, is that it is right at that limit of what writing can accomplish, and it does it in such a way to where that pain that she's trying to explain is like barely articulated, but is still nonetheless, despite the strain, articulated. Now, the reason why I brought up C.S. Lewis as an example of The Problem of Pain is because that book is often criticized as being something that he wrote that captured the pain very well, but that also was too raw, too visceral. It was inaccessible in that way. And I actually think that Joan Didion's book is another example of a book that I think is similar in that way. It is inaccessible. She's describing these very difficult scenes of people who have suffered violence or suffered in general from a traumatic death, and that makes the book really difficult to read. And so I think what makes this book really fascinating is that even though it captures that theme of death, and even though it captures the limits, it still attempts to articulate it nonetheless. Now, there's a lot of ways that we can look at this kind of thing. Should writing articulate truths that are very difficult? Should writing articulate truths that are very hard to explain or hard to express and translate into words? And I would say as a writer that yes, of course you should. And I think what's interesting about this book is that because it's right at the limit of what could actually be conveyed, I think it shows the effort matters. I think it shows that yes, you can't always think your way out of trauma. You can't always write your way out of difficulty in life and out of the reality of death. but I think it's certainly worth it to try. And I think that that's one of the points that I most definitely want to bring up, is that I think we go through things in life that can be incredibly traumatic, but that I think we should, as writers, try to write about. I think we should try to express it. I think we should try to articulate it. People might critique the problem of pain or the year of magical thinking as capturing this thing that is inaccessible and that might not even be worth reading. But I think the act of writing it and having people actually read it and engage with it is exactly part of that healing and cathartic process that I think is so important to understanding literature, understanding yourself, understanding the world, and understanding your own writing. And so I most definitely think that it is absolutely worth it to try to understand these things, even if they are incredibly painful and even if they are incredibly difficult. So in conclusion, I wanted to say that while we can acknowledge that writing is limited in a lot of ways, that it can't translate everything that we experience, that it can't represent everything that we could possibly go through, I think that it's important for showing us what we are actually able to communicate whenever we dig in deep, whenever we are really trying to understand. I think that that is incredibly important to be aware of, because I think it's really easy to get jaded. I think it's easy to assume that we can't communicate anything or that there's no point in communicating it. But I think what Joan Didion's book shows is that with that rawness and with being right on the edge of what could possibly be communicated and how painful it actually is, I think it shows that writing is definitely a valuable and meaningful way of trying to understand things. And that is what I encourage writers to do in their own experiences as writers and in life, is to be able to try to capture it. That's something that I believe and something that I continually pursue in my own creative life. And while yes, it is heavy, and while yes, it is difficult, I think that it is most definitely worth doing. And yes, there might be times where we have to choke the words out. There might be times where we can't write at all. There might be times where the words just won't come. But the more that we pursue that path, and the more that we try to make that writing legible and that experience legible, the more that I think we are able to heal, and the more that we're able to discover what it is we're trying to express and understand what it is we are experiencing. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. Thank you for listening. I hope that this inspires you with your writing and reading. I hope that you'll check this book out. I think that it is an amazing book, The Year of Magical Thinking. I think it definitely captures an amazing theme. And I think that, again, it's very raw and difficult to read, but I think it is definitely worth your time. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. Thank you for listening, and I will see you soon.